Invitations are very common in our society. We receive all kinds of invitations. We get invitations to weddings. People are invited to baby showers. We get invitations to wedding anniversaries as we celebrate the marriage of a specific couple for a specific period of time. We are invited to graduation ceremonies as people get congratulated for completing a specific course or a degree. Adrian Rich, the American poet, once said, "Change is not a threat to your life, but an invitation to live." Jesus would issue such an invitation to the 12 men that have just returned from a very successful mission trip. You will remember in Mark chapter 6 verses 7 to 13, Jesus sent these men out to declare or proclaim the kingdom of God. And by essence, they were extensions of his ministry. And with the sending out, he gave them authority over the evil spirits. And these men went out on that mission and came back with a very successful report. The people not only welcomed them, the people gave them a positive response to their ministries. God blessed their ministries by healing the people that needed healing, and they had authority over the evil spirits. So upon their return, they came back with a desire to tell Jesus what they had done and what they had taught. With them came a bit of a fan base. Some of the people who benefited from their ministry followed them back to their meeting place with Jesus. And so the disciples came back with a desire to report, but to report in such a way that it will be broadcasting their ministry feats. And by doing so, they would get the endorsement of the crowd that followed them back. It was, by all accounts, a small crowd. And so they came back with much more than just a good report. They came back with an inflated sense of self-importance, but also with a bloated ego. And Jesus does not rebuke them, but rather he invites them. And this invitation, or in the words of Adrian Rich, is an invitation to live. For we read in Mark chapter 6, verse 31, Jesus invites them, not rebuking them, "Come away to a deserted place all by yourselves." And so Jesus invited the disciples to be separated from the crowd and to exclusively learn from him. For we read the full invitation in Mark chapter 6, verses 31 to 32. And he said to them, "Come by yourselves to a deserted place and rest for a while." And Mark tells us that there was a fan base, for there were many coming and going, and they did not even have a time to eat. And so they departed to a deserted place in a boat by themselves. And so Jesus doesn't rebuke them, but he invites them to a type of ministry retreat. And Mark gives us 4 reasons for this invitation. 2 is very clear in the text. The other 2 is implied from the text. Jesus states, "Let's go to a quiet place." So there's an invitation for them to rest. Ministry takes a toll on one's body. And so their physical resources were depleted. And so they were tired, but they were unaware of their tiredness. Their spiritual resources and their emotional resources was also tapped out, because ministry does that to a minister. And so Jesus diagnosed their problem, and he says, "Let's go to a quiet place and rest for a while." So the first reason is for them to rest. The second one is clearly stated also in the text, is that to eat. The fans that followed them back was disturbing their plan for a quiet dinner. And so Jesus wanted to enjoy a meal with his 12 men, and so they couldn't do that because of the people that was following them and then blocking them from having a quiet meal. And so two reasons Mark says. Number one, he wants them to rest. The second reason is for them to enjoy a quiet meal together. But there are other two reasons that Mark states, but it's implied. The third reason that Jesus took them out from the crowd and invites them to learn and live is to remove them from the desire to broadcast their ministry. And so when the 12 men were together and there were a fan based with them, they wanted to report, but report in such a way that the crowd around them, be it a smaller one, would applaud their feats in ministry and they would be endorsed by the crowd. And Jesus takes them away from the crowd so that they could be neutralized. If they are among other people who did the same thing as they did, then the reason for bragging is no longer there. And so he takes them and invites them to live and to learn from him, because not only did he want them to rest, he wanted them to eat, but he also wanted to neutralize their desire to broadcast. And there's a fourth reason. He wanted them to follow him, or invited them to a ministry retreat so that they could learn from him. There was a vital lesson in the ministry that God would give them that they had to learn. They've been learning up to this point, but there was an additional layer that they needed to learn if they were going to be a success in ministry. And so Jesus invites them, or in the words of Adrian Rich, to live. Why? Because they were tired, they needed to rest. 2, because they needed to eat. 3 was to neutralize their desire to broadcast. And more importantly, he wanted to teach them an important lesson about ministry. And so he needed them to come away for a while. And so the invitation, once again, was an invitation to learn and then to live. So what did Jesus want them to learn? He wanted to reveal to them an additional layer about his person. That not only was he the promised Messiah, but he was also the promised messianic shepherd of the Old Testament. Up to this point, Jesus had been teaching them and giving them reasons why they need to place their confidence in him. And so they are developing this curriculum, or this picture of Jesus that is multifaceted. And now Jesus is about to add another layer to the image that they have about him. And so he invites them to a ministry retreat to learn from him. And the question that I will explore in this short talk is, what did Jesus wanted them to learn? The first clue as to what Jesus wanted them to learn comes in the text itself. Jesus invites them to a quiet place. Some translation says to a solitary place. But in essence, the Greek word there is to a wilderness place. And so Mark gives us a clue as to what Jesus were inviting them to by using the word wilderness. In Israel's history, wilderness played a very important role. And so by reading this word wilderness, they would have raised a red flag. Wait a minute, here is something that we need to learn. And so when Jesus says, come with me to a ministry retreat or to a wilderness place, it's a flag that he wanted to teach them something. And wilderness played a very important role in the history of Israel. You will remember in the Old Testament, particularly in the first 5 books in the Old Testament, Israel found themselves in slavery. God raised up Moses to take on the forces of Pharaoh so that Pharaoh would let the people go. Magnificently and miraculously, God leads them out of captivity into the wilderness place. And there, under the leadership of Moses, they were taken to the promised land. And so when Moses was coming to the end of his ministry, in the book of Deuteronomy, he's teaching the second generation, because the first generation has died out because of the rebellion with God, to God. And so Moses prepares the people for the ultimate goal, and that is to enter into the promised land. And so the wilderness was very important in the program of God, because there in the wilderness, it was a place where God taught the people of Israel. The wilderness was a place of teaching. For we read in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 14, Moses tells the people, "The Lord commanded me at that time to teach you the statutes and rules, that you might do them in the land that you are about to go to possess." Again, Mark tells us the wilderness place was a place of teaching because Moses taught the people. Again, another verse, Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 1. "Now this is the commandment," says Moses, "the statutes and the rules that the Lord your God commanded me to teach you, that you might do them in the place in which you are going over to possess it." Again, Moses says that all those 40 years that you wandered in the desert, your fathers have now died out, and now you are inheriting the promised land, and that 40 years was a time of teaching. And so when Jesus says, "Let's go to a wilderness place," Jesus is going to teach his disciples something in the wilderness. There was something that they needed to learn that they were missing out even in their development. And so when Jesus says, "Let's go to a wilderness place," the people reading this text sees it as a flag that says, wait a minute, Jesus wants to teach his disciples something, and therefore he wants to take them to a wilderness place. I think on a spiritual level, if you and I are going through what could be described as a spiritual wilderness, we must learn to set our antennas up, because God is wanting to teach us something even in our wilderness experience. And here with the 12 men, they needed to learn something that was missing in their development. And so Jesus invited them to a wilderness place. The second thing that the wilderness meant to Israel is that it was a place of testing. Moses says to the people again in Deuteronomy, "Do not do certain things." Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 16. "You shall not put the Lord your God to the test as you tested him at Massah." You will remember that there, when they were about to go over into the promised land, they sent out 12 men to spy out the land, and 10 of them came back with a bad report. And the people listened to the 10, and they rebelled against Moses, and directly they rebelled against God indirectly. And so they were tested in the wilderness place. And Moses says to the people of Israel, "Do not put the Lord to the test." And so that becomes a clue, a flag to those reading the text as they themselves were going through a wilderness experience. And so they realized that the wilderness was a place of testing. And so the disciples will be tested in the wilderness. We read also in Deuteronomy chapter 8 verse 2. And you shall remember the whole way of the Lord your God, said Moses, who has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, that he might humble you, testing to know what's in your heart. Again, the wilderness place was a place of testing. And so the disciples will learn, but also they will be tested by the Messiah, by the chief shepherd in the wilderness place. The third reason why the wilderness is so important to Israel and why it was such an important clue in the text is that the wilderness was a place of provision. We will remember after crossing the Red Sea, the people of Israel wandered in the desert for 40 years. But in Exodus chapter 15 verse 22, they were complaining about the lack of food. And so in Exodus chapter 16, while the people were wandering or walking in the wilderness of Zin, they complained to Moses and Aaron that they were dying of hunger. Exodus chapter 16, verses 1 to 3. In response, Yahweh said to Moses, Behold, I will rain down bread for you from heaven. As promised, Yahweh provided bread for the people of Israel, and the people ate as much as they wanted. And so when you see the word, come by yourselves to a wilderness place, not only was it a place of teaching, not only was it a place of testing, it was also a place of provision. Jesus would feed the 5,000 in the wilderness. And so when they went to a quiet place, by invitation of Jesus, he invited them to a wilderness place to teach them something, to test them, and then he will provide for them even in the wilderness. And so when you and I go through those wilderness experiences that we sometimes go through, we tend to forget that God might want to teach us something. So therefore we need to be open to be taught by him. God may be testing us to test what is in our hearts, or we know that he will provide for us with the strength and the provision we need to endure the wilderness. And fourthly is that the wilderness was also a place of rest. We read in Mark tells us, come by yourselves to a wilderness place to rest for a while. It's an allusion to Psalm 23 verse 2, where David writes about God leading him into the wilderness and God being the shepherd. For he says in Psalm 23 verse 2, He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. And David describes how Yahweh cares for him by making him lie down in green, grassy meadows and restful waters. And Jesus is about to teach his disciples a lesson concerning himself and ministry, and it has something to do with being a shepherd. And so in Mark tells us the invitation is, let's go to a wilderness place. And Mark tells us that the wilderness place was a place of teaching for the Israelites, and therefore it will be a place of teaching to the disciples, and for us, a place of teaching where we need to learn something as the disciples did. It was also a place where God tested them. It was also a place where God provided for them. And in the wilderness, it will be a place where God will give them rest, because Jesus is the ultimate shepherd. And then in Mark chapter 6, verse 33, he gives us another element to the story, and that is the crowd. And so we read in Mark chapter 6, verse 33, but many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. And so the plan for Jesus and the plan that he had for his disciples was to invite them to a wilderness place, but there's a crowd that disrupted those plans. In Palestine, early Palestine, there was not much to do, and people, after they have fished or after they have planted their crops, were sitting around. And to see a crowd following a boat attracted even a bigger crowd. And so you had this snowball effect as more and more people joined the crowd that was following the boat, and they got ahead of the boat and waited for them when the boat would come to shore. And so the enthusiasm of the crowd is expressed by the phrase, they ran from all the crowd. And so what would Jesus do with this unwelcomed interruption? The tension between Jesus and the crowd continues to build as the crowd follows them along the shore. And Mark draws us into the narrative by saying the crowd was waiting for them. And now the crowd comes and they disrupt the plans that Jesus had to be with his 12 disciples. And one would expect Jesus to be angry, but instead he is compassionate. For we read in chapter 6, verse 34, when Jesus landed and saw the large crowd, he wasn't irritated, but rather he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. So upon disembarking, Jesus saw the crowd, and instead of being angry, in the words of Mark, is that he had compassion for them. The word for compassion is that he was moved to his bowels for them. And then he gives them the reason, for they were like sheep without the shepherd. And Jesus corrected their shepherdlessness by teaching them many things. And so what Mark does here is that he introduced another layer to the character of the personality of Jesus. Not only was he the one who healed, not only was he the one who drove out demons, not only was he the one who quieted the storm by the power of his word, what Mark is going to introduce us and his 12 disciples is to a compassionate shepherd. Instead of being irritated and angry at the crowd for disrupting his plans for the day, Jesus saw the crowd and he had compassion on them. And the reason for that was that they were like sheep without a shepherd. And Jesus corrects this shepherdlessness by teaching them many things. In the next lesson, we will see how Mark unfolds Jesus as the promised Messiah, but also the promised messianic shepherd of the Old Testament. And so what Jesus does here, he issued an invitation to his disciples to learn and also to live. Instead of rebuking them for their arrogance, Jesus invites them to a wilderness place because he wanted to teach them something, and therefore by extension teach us something in our wilderness experience. He wanted to provide for them. He wanted to test them, then provide for them, and then Jesus wanted to give them rest. And if we and you and us all are going through a wilderness experience, it's a time where we need to learn something about ourselves and, more importantly, something about God. We need to look out in our wilderness places to how God is testing us to discover what's in our hearts. Thirdly is that in the wilderness experience, the disciples would learn that God provides for His people. And when you and I go through our wilderness experiences, we will discover God providing the strength and the endurance for us to endure those wilderness experiences. But also, in our wilderness experience, we discover a God who wants to give us rest. That Jesus is the ultimate shepherd who wants to give us rest, for He invites us, "Come to me, all who are burdened and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." And the disciples had to learn that lesson. And as they came ashore, they were met by a crowd that was uninvited, that was unexpected. And the crowd would have disrupted and did disrupt the plans that Jesus had for His disciples. But instead of rebuking the crowd, He has compassion on them. He was moved in His innermost being because they were sheep without a shepherd. And so in the next lesson, we learn more about this messianic shepherd that was promised in the Old Testament and now has become a reality in the presence of Jesus Christ. And so in the next lesson, we'll learn about